With a pilgrim-like reverence, I walked into the Art Science Museum at Marina Bay Sands in Singapore, for the museum was exhibiting 13 original pages of Leonardo da Vinci's Codex Atlanticus, part of da Vinci's repute as a military strategist and inventor stems from the content of his manuscript. It was approaching noon on a weekday. Apart from 2 or 3 sporadic visitors who came and went, I was almost alone in that dim, photography forbidden room. Through just a single layer of glass, I quietly gazed at Da Vinci's brushstrokes from 500 years ago for over half an hour. Yet the exhibition made no mention of a fact I was then unaware of. More than 200 years earlier, this manuscript had been caught up in Italy's cultural catastrophe, witnessing the unseemly process by which a royal palace in Paris evolved into Europe's and even the world's premier art palace. When the Louvre was first constructed in the late 12th century, it was a defensive fortress on the banks of Seine River. Over the following centuries, it underwent the multiple expansions and successfully served as residence of successive monarchs. After the French royal family moved to the Palace of Versailles, it became a repository for royal collections, a major function of which was to flaunt the king's wealth and power. Guests were invited to tour the Louvre, where, surrounded by an array of exquisite masterpieces by renowned artists, they would be made to feel the king's authority and aesthetic taste by the late Bourbon dynasty. The ruling class monopoly over social resources had reached an unprecedented level, and the rights to create and appreciate art were also monopolized by the top echelons of society. The guild system inherited from the Middle Ages had by this time evolved into a tool for the royal court to control artists. Their creations were heavily influenced by royal preferences, and only a select few artists favored by the royal family were granted a degree of freedom to break free from guild control. This filled numerous artists with a sense of humiliation, as they felt they were no more than a beaten craftsman. Against this backdrop, a group of artists stepped forward. Charles Lebrun, who was not yet 30 years old, but already the chief court painter, leveraged his favorite status to organize a group of artists to jointly submit a petition. In the end, the request was approved in 1648 under the auspices of Cardinal Mazarin, who also served as France's chief minister. A brand new institution, the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, was established. Lebrun was appointed its director, and its headquarters were set up in the Louvre. Members of Academy no longer took orders from the royal court, but instead reported to Lebrun, thereby gaining greater freedom. Over the next few decades, this institution gradually seized absolute authority over art education, criticism, and promotion across France. Members gathered regularly at the Louvre to engage in fierce debates over what kind of art deserved official recognition. These gatherings, known as salons at the time, were the precursor to today's art exhibitions. This approach of concentrating resources to achieve grand goals gradually widened the gap between French art and that of other European countries, cementing France's status as Europe's art capital. In turn, the appeal of its soft power further enhanced France's influence in other spheres. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted. The monarchy was overthrown, and the Louvre, along with its royal collections, became targets of looting and vandalism by revolutionaries. The Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture was also forced to cease operations. However, after over a century of development, the French had finally fully come to realize the importance of art as a source of discourse power. Thus, with a new rhetorical veneer, the revolutionary government reopened the Louvre's doors on the first anniversary of Louis XVI's arrest, branding it as the French National Museum and opening it to the public, declaring that this act was returning the Louvre and its artworks to their rightful owners, the free people of France. From the early days of the French Revolution, as nobles and clergymen fled in haste, a large number of their collections were left behind in France and seized as state property. Within the revolutionary government, some advocated destroying these items, which they saw as symbols of the decadent old regime. Nevertheless, selling these confiscated artworks constituted a major source of fiscal revenue for the new government. In 1790, the revolutionary government assembled a group of collectors, artists, and scientists to form a commission of monuments, tasked with the organized seizure and disposal of these items. Under their direction, the confiscation process was carried out in an orderly manner, with decisions made on which items to sell, to destroy, or to preserve. The finest and most valuable artworks retained through this process were placed in the Louvre, while the rest were distributed to various museums across France. Yet this commission of monuments would soon evolve into a tool for systematic plunder. During the wars against the First Coalition, war broke out in 1793, and although France faced the daunting prospect of fighting on nearly all of its borders simultaneously, it successfully repelled the forces of the First Coalition and occupied a vast swathe of territory. In these occupied regions, French troops plundered enormous quantities of wealth and art to subsidize military expenditures. Initially, the plundering was left to the discretion of individual soldiers, but when the items transported back to France were inspected by the Commission of Monuments, few were found to be significant value. In January 1794, the French government dispatched a team of experts from the Commission of Monuments to accompany French military forces to Belgium. These experts carried with them guidelines prepared in advance by the Commission. Their objectives crystal clear. They carefully selected a large number of cultural relics from museums, universities, churches, palaces, and private collections in cities such as Louvain and Antwerp, shipping them to Paris in batches. The first batch alone included 55 paintings by Rubens and 18 by Rembrandt, masterpieces that were all deposited in the Louvre. From this point onward, France's plunder of artworks gradually developed into a systematic strategy, with the explicit goal of establishing Paris as a former art capital of Europe. The Italian peninsula naturally became a primary target for plunder. Under the leadership of Napoleon, then commander-in-chief of the French Army of Italy, the team of experts carried out a comprehensive and methodical campaign of plunder across Italy. In April 1793, Napoleon led his army into Italy, swiftly capturing numerous city-states on the Italian peninsula within a matter of days. While French forces were attacking the Sforza castle in Milan, the team of experts visited the nearby Biblioteca, from where they removed partial sketches of Raphael's famous fresco, The School of Athens, 12 paintings by Da Vinci, and a large number of manuscripts, including the aforementioned Codex Atlanticus. Later, they also took Titian's Christ crowned with thorns from the Church of Santa Maria in Venice. The French removed the renowned painting, The Wedding Feast at Cana, from the walls of Basilica. To facilitate transportation, this oil painting, nearly 7 square meters in size and weighing 1.5 tons, including its frame, was cut into 2 pieces and shipped back to Paris. To this day, it hangs in the Louvre, directly opposite to Mona Lisa, and is the largest oil painting in the museum's collection. After capturing Bologna, which was under papal control, the Pope offered 500 manuscripts and 100 artworks as a ransom to secure Napoleon's promise not to occupy Rome. Furthermore, the Pope was required to bear the cost of transporting these 500 manuscripts and 100 artworks to Paris. The team of experts accompanying the French army additionally seized 31 paintings from Bologna, including works by Raphael, his teacher Perugino, a fellow student of Da Vinci, and other artists. The same pattern of plunder was repeated in cities such as Turin, Rome, Parma, Modena, and so on. In total, the French transported over 500 of Italy's finest paintings and sculptures, as well as hundreds of manuscripts, back to France. These items were classified and allocated to the Louvre and some other museums in France, while the number of so-called ordinary cultural relics that were sold off or destroyed was incalculable. Subsequently, during Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, The work of the expert team became even more systematized as they carefully selected a vast number of highly valuable cultural relics from across Egypt following the defeat of French forces at the Battle of Alexandria under the terms of the Surrender Treaty. Signed by France in 1801, larger artifacts such as the Rosetta Stone were transferred to the Anglo-Ottoman coalition for disposal, eventually ending up in the British Museum. Smaller artifacts, however, were permitted to remain in French hands and were subsequently transported back to Paris by Napoleon's army in accordance with the original plan. Although the Egyptian expedition ended in military defeat, the expert team accumulated a wealth of experience in the systematic plunder of cultural relics after Napoleon ascended to power as the ruler of France. Dominique Vivant-Denon, a member of the expert team who had distinguished himself during the Egyptian expedition and was known as Napoleon's Eye, was appointed the first director of the Louvre. Concurrently, he served as the highest-ranking government official, responsible for overseeing the nation's museum system. In his capacity as Louvre director, Vivant-Denon accompanied French generals back to the Tuscany region of Italy. There, he plundered a large number of artworks, including masterpieces by Michelangelo, Raphael, Vasari, and Rubens, from institutions such as the Galleria Palatina in Florence and the churches and the monasteries. All these looted treasures were shipped back to the Louvre. Denon also oversaw the plunder of countless more cultural relics in cities such as Madrid, Berlin, Vienna, Nuremberg, and Potsdam. Lower value items were sold off directly to subsidize military expenses, while the rest were transported back to the Louvre in batches. For centralized processing, artifacts deemed to be the highest quality were retained for the Louvre's collection. Ancient books and manuscripts were sent to France, and the remainder were distributed to various provincial museums. To commemorate his contributions, Louvre named one of its three main exhibition wings, Denon Wing, in his honor. This systematic, government-organized plundering campaign continued until the restoration of Louis XVIII to the French throne in 1814, following the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars. To this day, Italy and the various former French colonies continue to demand the return of their looted cultural relics. Yet, much like the British Museum, the mainstream sentiment in France is an unwavering refusal to return these artifacts. They argue that plundering war spoils is a long-standing tradition in human history, one that, while perhaps immoral, was illegally permissible at the time. However, after the defeat, all the Italian city-states were forced to sign agreements with Napoleon, which obligated local rulers to allow French troops to seize various paintings, sculptures, and other cultural relics in accordance with the list drawn up by the accompanying expert team. It was through such underhanded means that the French cloaked their plunder of war, spoils the veneer of legality. Following the restoration of Bourbon dynasty, Louis XVIII, in an effort to restore diplomatic relations with neighboring countries, ordered the return of some of the looted items. During World War II, the Nazis plundered a vast number of artworks from France. After the war, France demanded the return of 61,000 of these items, of which 45,000 were eventually returned to the original owners or their descendants. After Orstein looted over 9,000 artifacts from Don Juan, Paul Pilliet, Europe's most renowned cellulogist at the time, arrived at Mogao Grottoes in 1908. In 1908, Stein, who could not understand Chinese, who selected artifacts from the library cave largely based on intuition, and the majority of the items he took were of relatively low value. In contrast, Pilliet, who was fluent in Chinese, spent 3 weeks meticulously examining every scroll in the library cave. At the height of his productivity, he inspected an average of over 100 scrolls per hour. In the end, he carefully selected 7,000 plus artifacts, paying a mere 500 taels of silver to loot almost all of the most valuable treasures. Among the Dunhuang cultural relics, by a strange coincidence. The first day Pilliet entered the library cave was Mardi Gras in Europe, and the day after he left Dunhuang marked his 30th birthday. These 7,000 plus Dunhuang artifacts, which would later establish his reputation as a leading academic in Europe, were perhaps the most extravagant birthday gift of his life. The massive number of cultural relics plundered from China, combined with Europe's relatively sophisticated research systems and sound economic foundation at the time, elevated French sinology to unprecedented heights, with Pilliet himself emerging as the world's preeminent authority on China studies. Chinese scholar Fu Shinian and Chen Yingke both once lamented that the center of sinology lies abroad. The same phenomenon occurred in Egypt. Dominic Van Dennen, the first director of the Louvre, who had helped Napoleon, who plundered a colossal number of cultural relics from Egypt, is widely regarded as the founding father of modern Egyptology. Since the Louvre was designated as France's national museums, European museums have gradually lost their inherent, purely cultural and artistic attributes, transforming instead into political tools for showcasing the national soft power. Institutions such as Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands, founded in 1800, the Museo Nacional de Prado in Madrid, Spain, opened to the public in 1819, and the National Gallery in the United Kingdom, established in 1824, were all directly modeled after Louvre's approach. As the pioneer of museum politicization, the Louvre has consistently fulfilled its mission of safeguarding France's artistic discourse power in Europe and around the world. Today, as perhaps the most famous museum globally, renowned for its unparalleled curatorial standards and unmatched resource allocation capabilities, the Louvre does not merely display art, it leverages its status to define what constitutes art in the first place. If you visit the Louvre today, you will discover that the majority of the exhibition space in this so-called world's largest international museum is dedicated to the civilization of the Mediterranean region, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Renaissance Italy, and France itself, along with ancient Egypt, a civilization whose study was spearheaded by French scholars. The only other non-European culture granted a dedicated exhibition hall, located in the basement, is Islamic culture due to its religious significance. In contrast, cultures from regions such as Algeria, where France slaughtered half the country's population, Senegal and Polynesia, whose national wealth France plundered wholesale, and Asian and Latin America, all of which were once colonized by European powers, are crammed together in a tiny, out-of-the-way room in a corner of the museum. This state of affairs is rooted in the cultural superiority complex that emerged in Europe during the era of colonialism and the Industrial Revolution. Generations of Europeans raised under the influence of its superiority complex have generally held the belief that only the culture of Europe can give birth to the finest art. Cultures from other regions, especially those of countries once colonized and enslaved by Europeans, are deemed inferior in quality, value, and importance, destined ultimately to be assimilated by Europe's advanced civilization. Thus, even though countless exquisite cultural relics were plundered from China at great expense, most of them are locked away in the Louvre's storage vaults, with only a small number displayed in other French national museums that are considered inferior in status to the Louvre. Buddhist head chiseled off from the Longmen grottos in Luoyang, and paintings and wood carvings looted from Dunhuang by Paul Pilliet, and now housed in the Museumsgemäß. Over 30,000 pieces of porcelain and jewelry looted from the Old Summer Palace by the Anglo-French Allied forces were presented to Empress Eugenie, the wife of Napoleon III, and remain to this day in the palace of Fontainebleau. A suit of armor belonging to Emperor Qianlong, a sword, and a jade ruyi, all plundered from the Old Summer Palace, and now in a museum in Paris. Starting in the 1980s, Afro-Europeans spent nearly 20 years advocating for the display of African culture in French museums. their efforts culminating only in the opening of the museum in 2006. All non-European artworks are collectively labeled by them as primitive art, and even these so-called primitive artworks, in their view, only acquired the status of art because Europeans deemed them worthy of the title, a title that, nevertheless, does not grant them admission into the hollow halls of the Louvre. It's not from Africa. It was not art. It was meant to disappear. This kind of discourse power, defining what is art and what is not, exerts its influence in both visible and invisible ways across the globe. Today, the teaching and evaluation systems of major art academies in China are largely based on the French academic art system introduced by Xu Beihong, who studied in Paris in the early 20th century before returning to China. This system was later further developed by Zhang Zhaohe, a student of Xu Beihong, evolving into the Xujiang system, a sketch-based approach that dominated Chinese art education for decades. The very institution that played a pivotal role in establishing France as the capital of Europe's art before the Louvre was transformed into a national museum. Today, in industries related to art, particularly fashion, photography, and cosmetics, France remains firmly in the absolute top tier, even surpassing Italy. Whether artists from other regions can gain international recognition depends to a large extent not on their actual talent and skill, but on whether their work conforms to the aesthetic trends dictated by the France-led European art world, or alternatively, on whether they are more European than the Europeans themselves. A look at the Louvre's history makes it clear that discourse power, arrogance, prejudice it engenders are the result of deliberate effort by France to safeguard and perpetuate their cultural dominance over the centuries.